Sarah Chen never thought her day would end like this. The young space explorer sat in her crashed ship, her heart beating fast. She looked out the cracked window at a world she had never seen before. The ship's alarms were quiet now. Smoke rose from the broken engines. Sarah knew she had to leave the ship soon. But what waited for her outside? She checked her suit one last time. The air outside was breathable, but who knew what other dangers were out there? With a deep breath, Sarah pushed the door open. It made a loud noise as it fell off its hinges. The planet was beautiful and scary at the same time. Tall, strange trees with purple leaves reached up to a green sky. The ground was soft and spongy under her feet. In the distance, she heard noises that sounded like animals, but not any animals she knew. Sarah looked at her communication device. No signal. She was alone on this alien world. She started to walk, looking for anything that might help her. The trees seemed to watch her as she passed. Strange flowers opened and closed as she walked by. Everything was new and different. As the day went on, Sarah began to worry. She had not seen any water or food she could eat. The noises in the distance were getting louder. Were they coming closer? Just as she thought things couldn't get worse, she heard a loud roar. It was close. Too close. Sarah turned around slowly, her whole body shaking. There, standing on a rock, was the most terrifying creature Sarah had ever seen. It was big, bigger than any earth animal. Its skin was dark, almost black, and seemed to move like shadows. 6 eyes, glowing red, stared right at her. Its mouth opened, showing teeth as long as Sarah's hand. This was the apex predator of this world. Sarah knew it in her bones. This was the creature at the top of the food chain, and Sarah was in its territory. She didn't move. She barely breathed. The creature, Sarah would later call it the Shadow Claw, jumped down from the rock. It moved like water, smooth and fast. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but she knew that would be the end. The Shadow Claw came closer, its nose in the air. It was smelling her. Sarah closed her eyes, sure this was her last moment. But the attack didn't come. She opened one eye. The Shadow Claw was right in front of her, its head tilted to one side. It looked curious. Slowly, very slowly, Sarah raised her hand. The Shadow Claw watched her every move. She held her hand out, palm up, like she would to a dog on earth. The Shadow Claw looked at her hand, then back at her face. It made a sound, low and rumbly. Not quite a growl, but not friendly either. Sarah stayed still, her arms starting to hurt from holding it out. Then something amazing happened. The Shadow Claw moved forward and sniffed her hand. Its nose was cold and wet, like a dog's. Sarah held her breath. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Human and alien predator, face to face. 2 species that should never have met, sharing a touch. Then the Shadow Claw stepped back. It looked at Sarah one more time, then turned and ran into the forest. In seconds, it was gone, like it had never been there. Sarah fell to her knees, her legs weak with relief and wonder. She had just met the deadliest creature on this planet, and she was still alive. Not only alive, but she had touched it. As the green sun began to set, turning the sky a deep blue, Sarah knew her adventure was just beginning. She was lost on an alien world, yes, but she had also made contact with an incredible species, and something told her that this wasn't the last time she would see the Shadow Claw. With new energy, Sarah stood up. She needed to find shelter for the night. Tomorrow, she would start exploring this world properly. And maybe, just maybe, she would see her new friend again. As she walked into the darkening forest, Sarah smiled. This was why she had become an explorer, to see new worlds, to meet new life. And what life she had met. The galaxy was full of wonders, and Sarah Chen was ready to discover them all. The first light of the alien sun woke Sarah. She blinked, confused for a moment. Then she remembered. The crash, the strange planet, the Shadow Claw. It hadn't been a dream. Sarah sat up in the small cave she had found last night. Her body hurt from sleeping on the hard ground, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. She looked out of the cave. The world seemed different in the daylight. The purple leaves of the trees sparkled. Strange birds with 4 wings flew by. It was beautiful, but Sarah knew it was also dangerous. Her stomach growled. She needed food and water. Sarah checked her emergency pack. She had some food bars and a water filter. It wasn't much, but it would help her survive for now. Sarah started walking. She needed to find a water source. As she walked, she kept looking around. Every noise made her jump. Was it the shadow claw? Or something worse? After hours of walking, Sarah heard a sound that made her heart jump. Running water. She ran towards the noise and found a small stream. The water was pink, but her scanner said it was safe to drink. As Sarah filled her water bottle, she saw something move in the bushes. She froze. Slowly, a creature came out. It looked like a mix between a deer and a lizard. It had scales instead of fur and 6 legs instead of 4. Sarah didn't move. The creature looked at her with big purple eyes. Then it lowered its head to drink from the stream. Sarah smiled. Not everything on this planet wanted to eat her. But her smile didn't last long. A loud roar filled the air. The deer lizard looked up, terrified. Then it ran away so fast Sarah could hardly see it move. Sarah knew that roar. The shadow claw was back. She looked around, trying to find a place to hide. But she was too slow. The shadow claw burst out of the trees. It looked right at her with its 6 red eyes. Sarah's heart beat fast. What should she do? Run? Stay still? She remembered how curious the shadow claw had been yesterday. Maybe. Slowly, Sarah held out her hand, just like she had done before. The shadow claw tilted its head. It remembered too. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the shadow claw did something Sarah didn't expect. It sat down. Sarah blinked in surprise. Was this really happening? The deadliest predator on the planet was sitting in front of her like a big, scary dog. Carefully, Sarah took a step forward. The shadow claw watched her but didn't move. She took another step. Still, it sat there. Sarah's hand was shaking as she reached out. The shadow claw leaned forward. Its cold nose touched her hand. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Hello there," she said softly. "I guess we're friends now, huh?" The shadow claw made a low rumbling noise. Was that a good sound or a bad sound? Sarah wasn't sure, but the creature wasn't attacking her. That had to be good. Suddenly, the shadow claw's head turned. Its ears, which looked like small tentacles, moved. It stood up quickly, looking into the forest. Sarah heard it too, a low humming noise. It was getting louder. She looked up and saw something that made her heart sink. A ship was coming down through the clouds. But it wasn't a rescue ship. The ship was big and black. It looked dangerous. Sarah had heard stories about ships like this. They belonged to alien big game hunters, hunters who would love to catch a shadow claw. The shadow claw growled, showing its long teeth. It didn't like the ship either. Sarah knew she had to make a choice. She could try to signal the ship. Maybe they would rescue her. But what would they do to the shadow claw? Or she could run and hide with the shadow claw. It was dangerous, but somehow, Sarah felt safer with the big predator than with the hunters. She looked at the shadow claw. It looked back at her. In that moment, Sarah made her decision. "Come on," she said to the shadow claw. "We need to hide." To her surprise, the shadow claw seemed to understand. It turned and started walking into the forest. Sarah followed close behind. As they disappeared into the trees, Sarah heard the ship land. She knew things were about to get a lot more complicated. But as she looked at the shadow claw walking beside her, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a friend. An unlikely, dangerous friend, but a friend all the same. Together, maybe they could survive whatever was coming next. Sarah and the shadow claw moved quietly through the dense forest. The sound of the hunter's ship was fading behind them, but Sarah knew they weren't safe yet. She looked at her new companion, still amazed that she was walking next to the planet's deadliest predator. "We need to find a place to hide," Sarah whispered. The shadow claw turned its 6 red eyes towards her, tilting its head. Sarah wasn't sure if it understood her words, but it seemed to sense her urgency. Suddenly, the shadow claw's ears twitched. It looked to the left and made a low rumbling sound. Sarah followed its gaze and saw a small opening in a nearby cliff. A cave. "Good job," Sarah said, patting the shadow claw's side without thinking. Its skin felt cool and smooth like polished stone. The creature looked at her hand, then back at her face. It didn't seem angry. Was that a good sign? They entered the cave just as they heard voices in the distance. The hunters were getting closer. Sarah and the shadow claw moved deeper into the cave, away from the entrance. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah realized the cave was bigger than she thought. It went deep into the cliff, with many twisting tunnels. She took out her small light and turned it on. The shadow claw made a surprised noise at the sudden light. It blinked its many eyes, then leaned in to sniff the light. Sarah couldn't help but smile. This terrifying creature was curious, just like her. "I guess we're both exploring new things," Sarah said softly. She held the light out to the shadow claw. "See, it's okay. It's just a tool." The shadow claw watched as Sarah moved the light around. Then, to her surprise, it lifted one of its front legs and pointed at the light, then at a dark tunnel. Sarah's eyes widened. "You want me to light the way? You're smarter than I thought." She pointed the light down the tunnel, and the shadow claw started walking. Sarah followed, amazed at how easily they were working together. As they walked, Sarah's mind raced. How could she communicate better with the shadow claw? She needed to give it a name. Calling it the shadow claw in her head was getting tiring. "I think I'll call you Midnight," she said. The creature looked back at her. "You know, because your skin looks like the night sky." Midnight made a soft, rumbling noise. Was that approval? Sarah decided to take it as a yes. They walked for what felt like hours, going deeper into the cave system. Sarah's feet were starting to hurt, but she didn't want to stop. The hunters could still be out there. Suddenly, Midnight stopped. Sarah almost bumped into him. "What's wrong?" she asked. Midnight's ears were twitching again. He looked up at the cave ceiling. Sarah followed his gaze and gasped. The ceiling was covered in glowing spots, like stars. "Wow," Sarah breathed. "It's beautiful." As they watched, some of the spots started moving. They weren't stars. They were some kind of glowing insects. A few flew down, circling around Sarah and Midnight. Midnight watched the insects with great interest. He tried to catch one with his mouth, but it flew away just in time. Sarah laughed. "Careful," she said. "We don't know if they're safe to eat." Midnight looked at her, then at the insects, then back at her. He made a noise that sounded almost like a question. Sarah thought for a moment. Could she use this to start teaching Midnight some words? She pointed at herself. "Sarah," she said clearly. Then she pointed at Midnight. "Midnight." Finally, she pointed at the glowing insects. "Fireflies." Midnight watched her closely. He seemed to be trying to understand. Sarah repeated the process several times. To her amazement, Midnight started making different sounds for each thing she pointed at. They weren't words, but they were distinct sounds. "You're learning," Sarah said excitedly. "We're actually communicating." Midnight made the Sarah sound, then the firefly sound. Was he asking a question? Sarah thought she understood. "Yes, Sarah likes fireflies," she said, smiling. Midnight made a happy rumbling noise. He then made the midnight sound and the firefly sound. "Midnight likes fireflies too?" Sarah asked. Midnight nodded his big head. Sarah's jaw dropped. He had understood her question. As they sat there, surrounded by the glow of the alien fireflies, Sarah felt a wave of hope. She was lost on an alien planet, hunted by dangerous aliens. But she wasn't alone. She had made a friend, an ally. and together they were learning to understand each other. Sarah knew they still faced many challenges. The hunters were still out there. She needed to find a way off this planet. But for now, in this moment, she felt at peace. She and Midnight would face whatever came next together. Sarah woke up to a gentle nudge. She opened her eyes to see Midnight's 6 red eyes staring at her. The shadow claw made a soft, rumbling noise, which Sarah had learned meant wake up or danger. "What is it, Midnight?" Sarah whispered, sitting up quickly. Her new friend's ears were twitching, a sign he heard something Sarah couldn't. Suddenly, Sarah heard it too, voices echoing through the cave. The hunters had found the entrance. "We need to move," Sarah said, gathering her few belongings. Midnight nodded, understanding her tone, if not her words. They crept deeper into the cave system, trying to be as quiet as possible. The glowing fireflies they had seen earlier were fewer here, making it harder to see. Sarah's small light helped, but she was afraid it might attract the hunters' attention. As they turned a corner, Sarah saw a faint light ahead. It wasn't the soft glow of the fireflies, but a harsh, artificial light. The hunters were closer than she thought. Midnight growled softly, his shadow-like skin seeming to ripple with tension. Sarah put a hand on his side, trying to calm him. She whispered. "We need to be quiet." They found a small side tunnel and squeezed into it, hoping the hunters would pass by. Sarah held her breath as she heard heavy footsteps approaching. "I'm telling you, I saw tracks leading this way," a gruff voice said. It was speaking in Galactic Standard, a language Sarah understood from her explorer training. "Are you sure it was the Shadow Claw?" Another voice asked. "This planet has many strange creatures." "I know what I saw," the first voice snapped. "And there was something else too. Smaller tracks, walking beside the Shadow Claw. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah's heart raced. They had seen her tracks. She looked at Midnight, who was watching her closely. He seemed to sense her fear. The voices were getting closer. Sarah could see the light from their lamps now, shining just past their hiding spot. She closed her eyes, praying they wouldn't look down the small tunnel. Suddenly, Midnight made a decision. He let out a loud roar that echoed through the cave, then darted out of their hiding spot. Sarah heard shouts of surprise and fear from the hunters. "There it is," one yelled. After it, Sarah heard the hunters' footsteps moving away, chasing after Midnight. Her heart was pounding. Midnight had put himself in danger to lead the hunters away from her. She waited a few moments to make sure the hunters were gone, then crept out of the tunnel. She had to find Midnight and help him somehow. As she moved through the cave, following the sounds of the chase, Sarah's mind raced. How could she help Midnight against armed hunters? She was just one human with no weapons. Then she remembered something from her survival training. Caves often had underground rivers. If she could find one, maybe she could use it to her advantage. Sarah listened carefully as she moved. Yes, there it was, the faint sound of running water. She followed the sound, moving as fast as she dared in the dim light. The noise of the chase was getting louder. Sarah could hear Midnight's roars and the shouts of the hunters. They were all getting closer to the underground river. Finally, Sarah saw it, a fast-flowing river cutting through the cave. The path next to it was narrow and slippery. Perfect. She heard Midnight's roar, very close now. Sarah positioned herself behind a large rock near the river's edge and waited. Moments later, Midnight came bounding around the corner, the hunters closed behind. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the right moment. As the first hunter came into view, Sarah jumped out and shouted as loud as she could. The hunter, surprised by her sudden appearance, lost his footing on the slippery path. With a yell, he fell into the fast-moving river. His fellow hunters stopped in shock, giving Midnight the chance to disappear into a side tunnel. "Who are you?" one of the remaining hunters demanded, pointing a weapon at Sarah. Sarah raised her hand slowly. "I'm Sarah Chen, a human explorer. My ship crashed on this planet." The hunters looked at each other in confusion. A human. Here, one said. But you were with the Shadow Claw. We saw the tracks. Sarah took a deep breath. This was her chance to save Midnight, and maybe herself too. That's right, she said, trying to sound confident. I befriended the Shadow Claw. He's intelligent and peaceful unless threatened. You don't need to hunt him. The hunters didn't lower their weapons, but they looked uncertain. Sarah pressed on. Think about it. A human, friends with the deadliest predator in the galaxy. Isn't that worth more than a simple hunt? Imagine what we could learn. As Sarah spoke, she saw a shadow move behind the hunters. Midnight had come back for her. The hunters, focused on Sarah, didn't notice. Sarah knew she had to keep talking, to give Midnight time to get into position. I propose a deal, she said. Let me show you what I've learned about the Shadow Claw. It could change everything we know about alien life. The hunters were listening now, their weapons lowering slightly. That's when Midnight made his move. As Midnight emerged from the shadows, Sarah's mind raced. She needed to prevent a fight. Quickly, she stepped between Midnight and the hunters. Wait, she shouted, holding up her hands. No one needs to get hurt here. The hunters raised their weapons, but Sarah stood her ground. She felt Midnight's presence behind her, a comforting warmth against her back. Look, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. You came here for a great hunt, right? To prove yourselves against the deadliest predator in the galaxy. The lead hunter nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Midnight. Sarah took a deep breath. What if I told you there's an even greater challenge? Something no one in the galaxy has ever done before. This caught their attention. The hunters exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. What do you mean, human? The lead hunter asked. Sarah smiled. I mean working with the Shadow Claw, not against it. Imagine being the first to form an alliance with these incredible creatures. Think of the stories you could tell, the respect you'd earn. The hunters lowered their weapons slightly, listening intently. But that's impossible, one hunter said. These beasts are killers, not allies. Sarah shook her head. That's where you're wrong. Midnight here, she gestured to the Shadow Claw, is intelligent and capable of friendship. I've been teaching him to communicate. To demonstrate, Sarah turned to Midnight. Midnight, say hello. Midnight let out a series of growls and clicks that sounded remarkably like hello in the hunter's language. The hunter's jaws dropped in amazement. How did you do that? The lead hunter asked, his voice filled with wonder. Sarah grinned. Human ingenuity and a lot of patience. Now, imagine what we could accomplish together. Your hunting skills, my ability to communicate with Midnight, and the Shadow Claw's strength and intelligence. The hunters were clearly intrigued, but still hesitant. Sarah knew she needed something more to convince them. Then, an idea struck her. I have a proposal, she said. A challenge that will test all of our skills. The lead hunter raised an eyebrow. We're listening. Sarah pointed down the cave tunnel. There's a rare mineral in these caves. It glows in the dark and is probably what attracts those firefly creatures we saw. If we can collect some, it could be incredibly valuable. The hunters nodded, understanding the potential profit. But, Sarah continued, the mineral is likely deep in the cave system, in areas too dangerous for any of us to reach alone. We'll need to work together. Your technology, my problem-solving skills, and Midnight's strength and cave navigation abilities. The lead hunter stroked his chin, considering the proposal. And how do we know the beast won't turn on us? Sarah placed a hand on Midnight's side. Because Midnight and I have a bond. He trusts me, and he'll trust you if you trust him. Plus, he's curious. This is a new adventure for him too. The hunters huddled together, discussing in low voices. Sarah held her breath, hoping her plan would work. Finally, the lead hunter turned back to her. Very well, human. We accept your challenge. But be warned. If this is a trick, we won't hesitate to complete our original hunt. Sarah nodded solemnly. Understood. Now, let's get started. First, we need to make some tools. Over the next few hours, Sarah's creativity shone. She used parts from the hunter's equipment to create makeshift mining tools. She fashioned protective gear from cave moss and sturdy vines. All the while, she kept talking, building trust between the unlikely team. Midnight watched with fascination as Sarah worked. He even started helping, fetching items Sarah needed and testing the strength of the vines. The hunters were impressed by Sarah's resourcefulness. "You humans are full of surprises," the lead hunter commented as Sarah finished a crude but effective helmet lamp. Sarah grinned. "You have no idea. Now let's find that mineral and make history." As they prepared to venture deeper into the cave system, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had turned a dangerous situation into an opportunity for cooperation and discovery. But the real test was yet to come. She looked at Midnight, who gazed back with his 6 red eyes. There was trust there, and something more, a shared sense of adventure. "Ready, buddy?" Sarah asked. Midnight made a rumbling sound of agreement. With a deep breath, Sarah turned to the hunters. "All right, team. Let's go where no human, hunter, or Shadowclaw has gone before. Together." And with that, the unlikely alliance set off into the unknown depths of the alien cave, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. The strange group, Sarah, Midnight, and the 3 hunters, moved deeper into the cave system. Their makeshift lamps cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air grew colder and damper as they descended. Sarah walked beside Midnight, her hand resting lightly on his side. The Shadowclaw's ears twitched constantly, alert for any danger. Behind them, the hunters whispered among themselves, still wary of their unusual alliance. Suddenly, Midnight stopped. He made a low growling sound that Sarah had learned meant danger ahead. Everyone froze. "What is it?" The lead hunter, whom Sarah now knew as Zark, asked quietly. Sarah shook her head. "I'm not sure. Midnight senses something." As if on cue, a loud rumbling echoed through the cave. The ground beneath their feet began to shake. "Earthquake!" Sarah shouted. "Everyone, find cover." The group scattered, seeking shelter under rock overhangs. Sarah and Midnight ducked under a large boulder just as rocks began falling from the ceiling. The cave shook violently for what felt like hours but was probably only a minute. When the shaking finally stopped, dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah called out, coughing. One by one, the hunters responded. They were shaken but unharmed. However, as the dust settled, they realized their path forward was now blocked by fallen rocks. "Great," Zark grumbled. "Now what?" Sarah looked at Midnight, an idea forming. "Midnight, can you find another way around?" The Shadowclaw tilted his head, considering. Then he made a series of clicks and growls. Sarah turned to the group. "He says there's another tunnel, but it's narrow and goes deep underground." The hunters looked skeptical. "And how do you know that's what he said?" one asked. "Trust," Sarah replied simply. "It's what this whole adventure is about, right?" After a moment's hesitation, Zark nodded. "Lead the way, human." Midnight led them to a small opening in the cave wall. It was barely big enough for the hunters to squeeze through. Sarah went first, followed by Midnight, who seemed to shrink his body somehow to fit through the tight space. The hunters came last, grunting with effort. The tunnel was dark and claustrophobic. They had to crawl on their hands and knees, guided only by the faint light of their lamps and Midnight's glowing eyes. Just when Sarah thought they couldn't go any further, the tunnel opened up into a massive cavern. And there, covering the walls, was the glowing mineral they had been seeking. "We found it," Sarah exclaimed, her voice echoing in the vast space. The hunters cheered, their earlier doubts forgotten in the excitement of discovery. But their celebration was short-lived. A deep, menacing roar filled the cavern. It was louder and more terrifying than anything Midnight had ever made. From the shadows emerged a creature that made even Midnight look small. It was like a shadow claw, but twice the size, with 8 glowing eyes instead of 6. The Alpha, Zark whispered in awe and fear. The massive creature roared again, advancing towards them. Midnight stepped in front of Sarah, growling a challenge to the Alpha. "No, Midnight," Sarah cried. "It's too big." But Midnight stood his ground. He looked back at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw determination and trust. He trusted her to find a way out of this, just as she had trusted him in the narrow tunnel. Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't fight this creature, and they couldn't outrun it. What would it want? Territory. Food. Then she remembered the glowing minerals. The Alpha lived here, surrounded by them. Maybe. "Everyone, grab some of the minerals," Sarah shouted. "As much as you can carry." The hunters looked confused but obeyed. Sarah grabbed handfuls of the glowing rocks, wincing at their sharp edges. The Alpha roared again, now just meters away. Midnight stood firm, but Sarah could see him trembling. "Now," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear, "everyone throw the minerals behind the Alpha. Create a half circle of light." They did as she said. The glowing minerals created a bright arc behind the massive creature. The Alpha turned, distracted by the sudden light. "Midnight, now. Roar as loud as you can," Sarah yelled. Midnight let out a deafening roar, amplified by the cavern walls. The Alpha, caught between the loud noise and the bright lights, looked confused and scared. "Everyone, roar," Sarah shouted. "Make as much noise as you can." The cavern filled with a cacophony of human and alien yells, Midnight's roars, and the echoes of it all. The Alpha, overwhelmed, backed away from the group. With a final, frustrated roar, it turned and disappeared into a dark tunnel. As silence fell, Sarah let out a shaky breath. She turned to see the hunters and Midnight staring at her in amazement. How did you know that would work?" Zark asked. Sarah smiled weakly. "I didn't, but I figured if it lived down here in the dark, bright lights and loud noises might scare it. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts." Midnight nuzzled Sarah's side, making a soft, approving sound. The hunters looked at each other, then at Sarah and Midnight. "You two," Zark said slowly, "are the most incredible team I've ever seen." As they began carefully collecting the glowing minerals, Sarah felt a warmth in her chest. They had faced the ultimate challenge and come out victorious. And in doing so, they had proven that trust, creativity, and teamwork could overcome even the deadliest of situations. The journey back to the surface would be long, but Sarah knew that with Midnight by her side and their new allies, they could face anything the galaxy threw at them. The journey back to the surface was long and tiring, but filled with a sense of triumph. Sarah, Midnight, and the hunters carried bags full of the glowing minerals. They talked and laughed, sharing stories of their home worlds and past adventures. As they neared the cave entrance, Sarah heard a familiar sound. Her heart leaped. That's a rescue ship," she exclaimed. They hurried out of the cave into the alien sunlight. Sure enough, a sleek spacecraft was landing in a clearing nearby. Sarah saw the emblem of the Galactic Exploration Court on its side. As the ship's doors opened, Sarah turned to her companions. "What happens now?" she asked, suddenly unsure. Zark, the lead hunter, looked at his team, then at Sarah and Midnight. He smiled, a gesture Sarah had learned was friendly for his species. "We have a new story to tell," he said. "One of cooperation, not conquest." Sarah felt relieved. She patted Midnight's side, feeling the Shadow Claw's quiet rumble of contentment. A group of officers from the rescue ship approached, their eyes widening at the sight of Sarah standing calmly next to the infamous Shadow Claw. "Sarah Chen," one officer asked hesitantly, "we've been searching for you since your ship went down. Are you okay?" Sarah grinned. "I'm more than okay. I've made some incredible friends." She gestured to Midnight and the hunters. and we have a lot to tell you." Over the next few hours, Sarah explained everything that had happened. The officers listened in amazement as she described her bond with Midnight, the alliance with the Hunters, and their underground adventure. "This is unprecedented," the lead officer said, shaking his head in wonder. "A human forming a bond with a Shadow Claw, cooperating with both the Predator and the Hunters. It's revolutionary." Zark stepped forward. "We were wrong about the Shadow Claws," he admitted. "They're not just mindless beasts. They're intelligent, capable of friendship and cooperation. We've learned a valuable lesson here." The officers looked at each other, clearly unsure how to proceed. "What do you propose we do?" one asked Sarah. Sarah took a deep breath. This was her chance to make a real difference. "I think we have an opportunity here," she said, "to change how we interact with new species. Instead of fearing or hunting them, we could try to understand them." She placed her hand on Midnight's side. The Shadow Claw nuzzled her gently, causing the officers to gasp in surprise. "Midnight and I have formed a bond that was thought impossible," Sarah continued. "Imagine what else we might learn if we approach other species with openness and respect." The lead officer nodded slowly. "You may be right. This could change everything we know about interspecies relations." Over the next few days, as they prepared to leave the planet, Sarah worked tirelessly. She helped the officers set up communication protocols with Midnight, teaching them the basics of Shadow Claw language. She mediated discussions between the Hunters and the Galactic Exploration Corps, turning potential conflict into collaboration. On the day of departure, Sarah stood at the entrance of the rescue ship. Midnight stood beside her, looking curiously at the spacecraft. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked him. Midnight made a series of clicks and growls that Sarah now understood perfectly. New adventures await. Sarah turned to the officers and Hunters gathered around. "We're ready," she announced. "Midnight and I will serve as ambassadors. We'll help establish peaceful contact with the Shadow Claws and other species." Zark stepped forward. "And we'll spread the word among other Hunters. It's time for a new approach, one of respect and cooperation." As the ship took off, Sarah looked out the window at the planet growing smaller below. Midnight pressed against her side, his 6 red eyes also fixed on the view. Sarah smiled, feeling a mix of excitement and contentment. They had not only survived an incredible adventure, but had also started a new chapter in galactic history. A chapter of understanding, cooperation, and friendship across species. As the ship entered hyperspace, Sarah knew that their greatest adventures were still to come. With Midnight by her side and their new allies supporting them, they were ready to show the galaxy the power of trust, creativity, and open-mindedness. The human and the Shadow Claw, once considered natural enemies, were now partners, friends, and a symbol of hope for a more united galaxy. Their bond had not only changed their lives but promised to change the lives of countless others across the stars. Sarah looked at Midnight and grinned. "Ready for our next adventure, buddy?" Midnight's answering rumble was all the confirmation she needed. Together, they were ready to face whatever the vast, mysterious galaxy had in store for them.